Hi everyone, welcome back to the SHCG conference 2021 for our afternoon sessions of day one of the conference. Next up, we've got Simon Brown, who's going to be taking us on a virtual tour of the National Justice Museum. So I'll pass over to Simon now. Thanks.
Thank you, Victoria. Hello, everyone. I hope I've unmuted myself correctly, and I'll just share my screen now. Okay, so hello, my name's Simon Brown. I'm project curator here at the National Justice Museum. And I was toying with the idea of doing some sort of quiz today to see if you were listening at the start to Andrea, but I won't, so don't worry, quiz is later. But yes, I work alongside Andrea Hadley-Johnson, whose talk this morning was brilliant, and I really enjoyed it, and I knew everything. So that was a really great introduction to our work here. So Andrea has already introduced what we do as a museum. And when we were asked to do a tour virtually, I thought, I can't take you around the entire building. It's massive. It was no jail. It was no prison. We'd be going over 5 stories and everything. So what I wanted to do was show you around one of our exhibitions. We decided to do this because this shows the front end, basically, and the outputs from all the processes that Andrea described so well this morning. So all those processes of co-production and working with people and working with people outside the museum to shape and inform what happens inside the museum. The Constraint Restraint exhibition is a great way of kind of explaining how that manifests in our exhibition space. So I'm going to take you around this exhibition. I started here at the same time as Andrea on the artistic program funded by the Arts Council program here. Our remit is to work with people, not to them, and for people outside the museum to shape and inform what happens inside the museum. So this exhibition is a really great example of that. I can claim no credit for it. It all comes from Andrea and from our colleague, senior curator and archivist Bev Baker, who are both brilliant people to work with and who you can see their work inside this. So the exhibition continues to live online. It's not up physically anymore, and it is developed online after it was physically open. So please have a look online. I didn't want to do it live today because I'm not certain Zoom would be able to handle it. So I thought I'll play it safe and show you some still images from it instead. And I can't describe all of it, sadly, but please do go and have a look. I'll put a link to it up at the end. Or somebody can do it now, actually. There's a task for someone. And then you can have a look while I'm going through. So here's how it'll look online. All of our exhibitions are scanned 3D and are put live on our website. Typically, we're in the middle of a website redevelopment at the moment, so I didn't want to give you a broken link. So this is how it looks on the V21 website. And V21 are the people, our partners, who come and scan the exhibitions for us. Based in Derby, but they work all over the country. We'd recommend them if you wanted to do any similar work. So before I go into showing you around the exhibition, I do need to mention the C word. I do need to mention COVID. Andrea touched upon it in her talk this morning, but this exhibition opened in February 2020. So I think it was open for 2 weeks before lockdown, which was obviously a time of great anxiety and stress for all of us, but also brought an entirely new perspective on the concept of constraint and restraint. We just opened an exhibition about constraint and restraint, and then suddenly we were all locked in our houses. So it was a very strange thing for us to go through. But we took the decision to obviously keep the virtual exhibition up, but also to allow it to live its own life in this new context. And you'll kind of see that as we go through it. So to go through the concepts that we used to go through it, the idea of constraint and restraint goes back to one of the very first ideation sessions that we held in the museum, right at the start of mine and Andrea's time here. And the theme of constraint and restraint came up in many responses to the prompts that we put to our colleagues and to visitors and to non-visitors. Obviously, those are words that resonate with the museum connection, not only physical restraint, but also the way in which the law restrains or seeks to restrain or doesn't. So all these kind of responses came back. So when we were sifting through the responses to that ideation session, we decided to take it further and circulate that question that Andrea raised this morning. What constraints would you like to be free from? So we had over 1,000 responses to that question. And we put that out through social media, through our, we have accounts on Instagram and Twitter that we use to play with these ideas. We put them out on there, we put them out in further ideation sessions, basically everyone we came into contact with, everyone that we came across. And they've been manifested in the exhibition. So here are some physical ways in which they're there. You'll see if you look in the top left, well, I'm hoping it's your top left, but there's an image with 3 squares. We have highlighted some of the words on the walls on the bottom. But certain words were repeated. We just decided to put the words on the wall. So you can see time, work, scars. These are things that always came up as a repeated theme. In the top right, you can see a wall display, kind of a playful way of representing some of them responses. So there's a load of clocks to represent time. There's a pile of piggy banks to represent money. So they're kind of playful ways of representing these things. A lot of talk about fashion and shoes and having to wear heels for work and things like that. But if you look in the top left of that display, there is a scold's bridle, which some of you may be familiar with. They tend to crop up in quite a few social history collections, but it's a really gruesome object. It fits over the head, and it's a medieval concept, but it was used right up until the late Victorian period, and it has a frame for holding the tongue. So if someone's been troublesome and is making noise, then a skull's bridle goes on their head and it holds the tongue so they can't speak. Obviously, it's a brutal and barbaric thing. They were used disproportionately on women, on people suffering with mental health difficulties, especially in prisons. So that's a really brutal object. And we've put that alongside these other kind of playful responses to constraints to kind of highlight that contrast, really. And in the bottom left is another reference to time as well, with pegging clocks. And in the bottom right is a screenshot from our gallery guide. So we just reprinted some of those written responses we got as well. As I say, we got a lot of responses to that question. And so one of our volunteers, George, he offered to record a soundscape of other people reading out other people's responses. So we had a list of responses, and George invited lots of other people to just read them out, and he recorded them, and that became a soundscape that was added to the online exhibition. And there's something there, there's something that really resonates about sharing voices. To have one person reading out someone else's words feels like a very simple and almost mundane act, but it resonates, it's powerful. It's powerful, not only for the person reading them out, but for anyone else to hear them. I'd recommend playing with that if any of you have the opportunity in the exhibition. So this gave us a focus for the objects in the collection. We found that many of the irrelevant objects were here in multiples. We have a lot of keys. We have a lot of restraints that we use in prisons. We have a lot of cell doors, pegging clocks and those kind of things. So we had a concept, responses relating to it, and groups of objects. So they're the things that we used to inform the rest of the processes. Some of those things that Andrea described this morning. So we took the objects out on object walks. Now, I know Andrea shared one of these images earlier, the one on the left. Andrea took the keys that we have to Emmanuel House, which is a homeless shelter in Nottingham that supports people who are experiencing homelessness. Spoke to them about the keys and about the concepts that we're dealing with, and someone had a tattoo on their arm of a key. It's amazing. In the top right is from a conversation group. So I took the keys to this group in Hyson Green Library in Nottingham, which was for people who are new to the country, and it's a forum and a space for them to practice their spoken English, so who are learning the language. And what they need is a stimulus. So for a guy to turn up with a load of objects from a museum was kind of manna from heaven for them, I think. But, so we had a long conversation. It was great. And one of the women there had this necklace, as you can see on the top right, of a key around her, which was really special to her. It was a present when they bought their first home. She was from Pakistan. She'd never had that connection with anything since moving to this country. So that was quite a powerful moment for me, actually. And in the bottom right is key cutters. Myself and our volunteer Katerina went to a key cutters in Victoria Market and gave them the keys and said, "What can you tell us? And tell us how you feel." And I had to be dragged out of there after half an hour. You know, they were telling us all sorts. So those kind of conversations are really great. They're sharing our work, but they're also bringing in perspectives. I would recommend all of you to try object walks, taking objects out and just seeing what people think. It's an amazing perspective to get. Andrea mentioned a couple of other things here as well. I wanted to talk about the swallowed objects that Andrea mentioned. There's some of those in the top left. So they're objects that have been swallowed by prisoners. And they were pertinent to this exhibition because often the reasons given for swallowing objects like this is to make sure you were taken to a medical wing, to get you out of your cell and to get medical attention, basically. So that's a way of being free of your constraint. And when we were working and setting up a workshop with Feng-Ru Lee, who's in the image at the top right, she's on the far right there. She mentioned she makes these sculptures out of icing sugar and sprayed gold. So there was something beautiful about creating something beautiful and edible based on objects that had been swallowed by prisoners and doing that with the public. So that's what she did. She ran this workshop as part of our Make It Yours workshop program to make these sculptures. And some of the sculptures that Feng-Ru has made went on display in the exhibition. So you can see them in the bottom right. There's a case there with the swallowed objects, and then next to them, some of those icing sugar responses. So that's a group of objects that have got a very public response in a new way. And often we're trying to find ways, especially with mundane objects, of finding new ways to look at them. And this exhibition is bursting with examples of that. The fact that we'd been able to develop the way the exhibition would look through our permanent collection meant that there were natural spaces for artistic commissions to drop in. So Feng-Ru Lee's was one of them. Andrea mentioned Nisa Khan, various other artists who've done really great work along this theme that sat outside the collection beautifully. I wanted to highlight this work by Elliot Moravsky, who has served a sentence himself and been in prison, I think, for approximately 6 months. And when he was in prison, he took rubbings of various parts of his cell and of his environment, his built environment around him. And he did that in order to communicate the very tactile nature of where he was to his partner on the outside. So that's why we got the word love on the wall there, because it was a way of communicating with people in this real constrained environment. That was a very powerful thing to see. It was a very powerful thing to speak with Elliot at the launch as well, you know, to speak about his experiences and why this, an artistic response, was the appropriate response for him. They are on, Elliot and Lisa, his partner, are on Instagram. So if you have a look, I think it's Blue Bag Life. You search them up on Instagram. And they talk a lot about experiences of prison and reform of the system, because the system needs reforming. If we've learned anything this week, then it's that. So these are ways in which the elements of the co-production process have informed the exhibition and what we've done. I mentioned the effect of the pandemic as well on the exhibition. When we had to close down for lockdown, we didn't know, of course, none of us knew exactly what was going to happen in the next week, never mind in the coming months. So we knew we had a very, very, very pertinent exhibition. We knew that we had it online already because it had been scanned already, thankfully. So the conversations kind of led from that. And what can we do to kind of be a useful part of civic society in this really strange time? So Andrea and our colleagues, and particularly our writer in residence, Dr. Martin Glynn, came up with this concept of letters of constraint as a way of kind of extending the exhibition in an appropriate way, both for the exhibition, but also for the situation we were all in. So it was an open invitation. We just put out this open invitation for anyone to write a reflective letter during the lockdown. So we encourage people to spend a mindful moment writing personal insights into their confinement, recording everyday feelings, moments and observations in a letter to the virus. So some of these responses were typed, some of them were handwritten. You can imagine that the perspectives they articulate were multiple. There was real anxiety, there was real hope, resilience, vulnerability, solidarity, you know, anything. That kind of whole spectrum came in, and we got a lot of letters sent to us in various ways. You know, some of them were posted to an empty building. So when we were able to come in and our maintenance colleagues were able to collect them for us and share them with us. But what that forms is really powerful archive of the responses of people all over the country, some people from all over the world, to this really stressful situation. It's powerful. It's a powerful archive. Dr. Martin Glynn has added to that. He was writing a new letter every day initially to just process his own feelings and his response to those as a writer. We also eventually invited people again to share voices. So you'll see in the bottom right on the slide there, we invited people to read out someone else's letter and to record a video of it in whatever medium they like. We would share that on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel for sharing kind of the ways of playing with our concepts. That was really powerful as well, because basically people would put their hand up for it and I would send them a random letter, randomly chosen letter, and then they would interpret it however they want. Some of them might read it out. One of our colleagues got her 6-year-old daughter to read out one of the letters, and they put that on a film with stills of their garden and of the nature and scenery around them that they were engaging with. Some really powerful stuff. So I'd urge you all to look on our YouTube channel. It's NJM Ideas. And that's kind of a digital extension of our project lab that Andrea mentioned as well. It's a digital space to complement the physical space here. And that project was shortlisted for a Museums Change Lives award last year for Best Lockdown Project. So that was real vindication for everyone that came up with it. So there are many other elements that I haven't described. So please do go and have a look at it. That's the link that works. So please do have a look at that. That NJM Ideas handle is there on Twitter, it's on Instagram, and it's on YouTube. So please do have a look and let us know what you think. You know, engage with it. And also please come and visit us physically now we're able. I hope to see you soon. So thank you for that. And I'll leave you with Victoria.
Thanks very much, Simon. Next up, we've got Dr. Anna Garnett with a paper entitled Addressing the Colonial and Imperial Histories at Petrie Museum. And just a reminder, if you've got any questions for the speakers this afternoon, do pop them in the chat for the Q&A. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And hi everyone, good afternoon. Please bear with me while I share my screen. Can you all see that? Can you see my screen? Can someone give me a thumbs up?
We can see it, Anna, thank you.
Lovely, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for having me. My name's Anna Garnett. I'm the curator of the Petrie Museum of Egyptian and Sudanese Archaeology at UCL. What I'm going to do today in the short time is talk to you a little bit about the museum and the background to an important project that I want to say recently finished, but it hasn't been recent, and I'll explain why, at the Petrie Museum, in particular highlighting issues relating to colonial and imperial histories embedded in the collection. The project that I'm about to discuss was generously funded by the DCMS Wolfson Museum and Galleries Improvement Fund, so we thank them very much indeed for their funding. So some of you may have visited the Petrie Museum, some of you may have heard about it, some of you may never have heard about it. It's quite tucked away for various reasons at UCL. We are a museum of Egyptian and Sudanese archaeology. We first opened our doors to the public in 1915. And since then, we've attracted visitors from all over the world, as well as providing invaluable resources for teaching and research. It's one of the most important and largest collections of Egyptian and Sudanese archaeology anywhere in the world. It's in the top 5 internationally. And in terms of volume of collection, we have 80,000 objects around about. And that's second only in number to the British Museum in the UK for Egyptian and Sudanese archaeology. The museum is named after our founder, a man called Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie, and I'll explain a little bit more about him as we go along. Now, we were formed as a teaching collection, originally formed in 1892, actually, before we were open as a museum, as a teaching collection, specifically designed to teach about objects, material types on a mass scale. And this very much continues today, of course, where we can around COVID restrictions. But we're very pleased to say that we're open again to the public, and as it's the start of a new academic year, we're delighted to welcome students and staff back into the collection to use it for their teaching and learning. Anyone who's visited the Petrie Museum will be quite familiar with this idea of a museum of a museum. When you step into the Petrie Museum, it's very historical layout for various reasons. I think you'll get a sense of that perhaps in the photograph here on the right-hand side. It's an aspect of the collection that our supporters love. They see the museum almost as an object in itself. I personally love this too, but I also understand that it can be incredibly difficult for many visitors to interpret the displays unless you're a specialist. And we've long moved beyond the time where someone should be an Egyptologist when they step into a museum about Egyptian archaeology. So alongside students and teaching staff as our core audiences, we absolutely consider the general public as a core audience. We have done since at least the 1970s. And we also have very specific other core audiences, including Egyptian and Sudanese people in the UK and in Egypt and Sudan. We've got a well-established and varied programme of events and activities for our core audiences, and these sit alongside our academic teaching activities and research. Over many years, long before I walked through the door of the Petrie Museum, the staff there were really kind of pioneering in terms of bringing varied audiences into the museum around events, teaching, research, you name it, the Petrie Museum did it first. And I like to think that we still continue to do that in many ways today. So the project that I want to talk about is the redevelopment of our entrance gallery of the Petrie Museum. And this is a very small space. I'll explain some of the kind of constraints around physical and kind of intellectual constraints around working in this very, very small entrance gallery space. What we wanted to do with this project is really to tell a story about the people behind the collection, and to shed light on some of the more kind of complex issues relating to the history of the collection, the legacies of its founders, and in so doing, foreground the important work of, for example, the Egyptian workforces, the hundreds of men, women, and children who are essentially the hidden hands behind the collection, and for example, also the stories of women behind the museum, which haven't always been told as prominently as they could have been in previous years. So this kind of investigation into the collection to provide a more kind of coherent, transparent entrance gallery for visitors, really the first thing that they're going to see when they come into this space. It really builds on important previous work by my colleagues at the museum, including Professor Stephen Quirk, Debbie Chalice, Alice Stevenson, and Sabadra Das, among others, who've worked incredibly hard over the past decade to bring these kind of hidden and honestly more controversial stories to a wider audience. And we really do thank these scholars for their vital work on these aspects of the collection. And we're very fortunate to be able to build on the really strong foundations that they've set here. Now, I shared in advance of my presentation a series of links, and if the organisers are able to, it'd be fantastic if you could share some of the links to some of these works that are available online. If it's a problem, I can also share afterwards if you'd like to know more. So this is the old entrance gallery of the Petrie Museum. So for around 20 years, the displays, well, again, historical, beautiful to many, with these lovely old cases, they haven't always been coherent. And it means that visitors aren't greeted with the clear, consistent messages and the language that they should be greeted with when they enter the museum. And this can often lead to confusion for the rest of the visit. Museum fatigue at the Petrie Museum is a very common thing. You would know exactly why if you'd visited, but you're bombarded with information. So it was really important to us when we were redeveloping the entrance gallery to think about how we could condense that information down into really manageable and meaningful kind of chunks for the visitors. The space is incredibly narrow. It can only really comfortably accommodate 2 or 3 people at any one time, bearing in mind this is before COVID. So even in we've redeveloped this space now, and I'll tell you how we've done that, made it slightly larger, but still we're looking at restricted numbers in this space. So physically, it is a tricky space to work with. So these photographs were taken believe mid 2019, and in spring 2020 we were delighted to reveal our new entrance gallery to the Petrie Museum. Spring 2020, lots of things were going on for all of us in spring 2020. And if I remember correctly, we opened the new gallery for about a week and a half before we had to close again for the COVID lockdown in March last year. So very few people have seen the entrance gallery so far, but I hope that you're able to come and visit now that we're reopened. So I hope you can see immediately that the kind of impact for visitors is quite immediate now when they come into the space. So we provide a clearer introduction to the museum collection. The project itself focused on telling the story of the 2 main founders of the collection, and I'll tell you a little bit about them now. But as we were working on this new display, really it became so important to us to be able to tell the stories of the many other people who are represented kind of silently behind the collection. We wanted to bring their stories to the fore. So the key visitor messages for this space include what are the legacies of Flinders Petrie, so Petrie being the founder of the collection, including in the field of museum archaeology. For better or worse, Flinders Petrie was known as the father of Egyptian archaeology. So I'm going to talk a bit about the problems there. Why is there an ancient Egyptian and Sudanese collection at UCL? Being as transparent as possible about why these objects are not in Egypt and Sudan, and why they're in a very small building on the first floor in a university building in London. So trying to be, again, as transparent as possible about that. Equally, why were people able to remove objects from Egypt and Sudan to make this collection in the first place? And addressing colonial and imperial histories behind the collection and behind the characters associated with it. While these questions have been asked in temporary exhibitions at the Petrie Museum in the past, they've never been part of a permanent display in the entrance gallery. So these are really some of the questions and themes that visitors are now greeted with as soon as they enter the space. We're offering what we hope is a more balanced, engaging and accessible introduction to the collection for all visitors. And we've really started to see that already. We've not been open long after lockdown restrictions have been lifted, but it's fantastic to, this sounds terrible, kind of float around silently in the gallery and listen to the sorts of things that visitors are saying about the displays, the sorts of questions that they're asking, particularly asking around the people that are represented there. So that's great. So very early stages, very first steps, but I believe that we're on the right path here. So I mentioned that this is also a more physically accessible space. The issue, a big issue with the Petrie Museum, as I mentioned, is that we're on the first floor of the building in a university. It's not very accessible. There is lift access through the library building next door, but it's not as physically as accessible as it could be. So we were able to knock through a wall to make this entrance gallery larger. So we have larger turning space for wheelchair users, for example, but we could do an awful lot more. So thinking about the kind of the physical access, but really the intellectual access to the collection in this space. As part of this project, we worked very collaboratively, bearing in mind that this all took place before the COVID lockdown. So in a time which I can barely remember now, where we could actually meet people in person around a table, have tea and biscuits. It was joyful. So through this kind of nuanced, honest interpretation of the museum's history, this was really, the themes that we chose to represent were really informed by representatives of our key stakeholder groups. And this is us kind of aiming to fulfill our ethical responsibility to deal with provocative and complex issues in a transparent way. But it's also absolutely best practice. This is how, I mean, any display really, but particularly those around colonial collections with colonial histories, this is absolutely how they should be approached. So for example, the development of the object list, the different themes and the choice of characters were guided by various stakeholder groups, including UCL students and staff. We also had an external partner group, a critical friends group, featuring members of the Egyptian and Sudanese community in London, representatives of our Museum Friends organisation, also representatives from groups relating to aspects of physical access, so South East London Vision, for example. So really looking to kind of cover as many of those issues relating to physical and intellectual access in the space as possible, and have them as informed as we could by these various external partners. It's truly a collaborative effort. We couldn't have done it without them. We're incredibly grateful for their guidance and their support. We also undertook a formal space audit with a company called IDAX, which again informed the kind of actions that we took towards physical access, and it really gives us a roadmap for the future there. We also worked closely with our front of house colleagues and volunteers, undertaking visitor surveys via audience agency to really kind of get to grips with what visitors wanted to see and what they believed they should be seeing in the entrance gallery of the Petrie Museum. So moving on, I'd just like to give a background to two of the kind of key characters represented in the new entrance gallery, and explain why some of the aspects of their history can be viewed as kind of quite controversial, complex to unpick. So the project was entitled Gateway to the World of Egyptology, and focused on telling the story of two key characters. This is Amelia Edwards. She was the founder of the collection, a writer, a journalist, an activist, passionate advocate for Egyptian archaeology. She visited Egypt in 1871, became hooked with the ancient and the modern history of Egypt. And she wrote her memoir of her visit, which you can see here on the left, 1,000 Miles Up the Nile. And she dedicated the rest of her life to supporting Egyptian archaeology. She was also able to collect objects from Egypt. Now, this is partly through a kind of distribution of objects through excavation, taking part within the kind of colonial administration of the late 19th and early 20th century. She also bought objects on the open market in Egypt. She bequeathed this collection of objects, around 1,000 objects, to UCL in 1892. And we feature many of these objects in the new entrance gallery. There's a difficult legacy there, which I'll talk a little bit about, but these are some of the first objects, Egyptian objects, to be at UCL. So this is 1892. Flinders Petrie, as I said, known as the father of Egyptian archaeology, which is a very problematic term in many ways. He has a complex legacy. He worked in Egypt and in the UK and elsewhere in the Near East in the late 19th and early 20th century. He worked hard to develop archaeology from what was a treasure hunt in the late 19th century into a science in the 20th century. His story is also a large part of this project and these new displays. We wanted to tell not only the story of his excavations, which is very much the kind of main theme of the Petrie Museum in the past, but we wanted to talk about his personal life and ideas. So in the new displays, we're able to show, thanks to the beautiful new cases, archival material relating to Flinders Petrie's career. For example, this gorgeous notebook sketching where he sketched the Giza pyramids in 1880 on his first visit to Egypt. And we've also got things like his excavation satchel and digging tool, which have never been on display before. But ultimately, we wanted to be able to tell the story of Petrie's career in a transparent way and his ideas. In particular, Petrie's approach to the racial stereotyping of ancient people, which continues to influence our understanding today in very, very problematic ways. And it's especially important that we hold these legacies to account. So Petrie was directly involved with the development of eugenics at UCL. He supplied, for example, human remains from Egypt for the study of eugenics at UCL. So he wasn't a bystander, he was very much involved. He also wrote incredibly racist articles and books and held these very racist generalizing ideas about different peoples. So for example, we have a description that he made of this object, which is a small terracotta head, which he described as a Kurd based on the type of the face as he describes it, in very, very generalizing terms. Now, this is absolutely something that we would not do today, but we wanted to be transparent about the fact that a lot of Petrie's work in archaeology and his own ideas are founded very much on these kind of racist ideals. And I mentioned Amelia Edwards' memoir also of her trip to Egypt, 1,000 miles up the Nile. In this book, which is fascinating in many ways, but it contains extremely racist language to describe modern Egyptian people, highly inappropriate language. And we're trying to tell these stories in the new entrance gallery, again, to be as transparent as we can about the history of the collection, but also to move away from this idea of hero worshipping in Egyptology, which has been extremely commonplace for many years. So moving very quickly, because I'm aware I've already used up all my time, I mentioned that we're also looking into the stories of women behind the collection. Again, hidden hands in so many ways, absolutely not credited as they should have been in recent times with the work that they did behind the collection. They're only recently being recognized for their work. The same goes for Petrie's Egyptian workforces. Now, over the last decade or so at the Petrie Museum, their stories have begun to be told. So for example, the lower left here, you can see images of the workers that we know to have excavated certain objects have been placed around the museum, naming them so that their legacy is intact, is visible in the museum. But in the entrance gallery, we wanted to make their story absolutely clear to all who were visiting. In particular, the story around children working for Flinders Petrie in Egypt in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Children, strict laws are in place now to ensure that children don't work. They're no longer employed to work on archaeological excavations. But in Petrie's time, this was commonplace. So, for example, we have a photograph on the right here of a girl on the right who gave her father's name when she signed up to work on the excavation at the site of Yanase for Petrie. She believed she had to give her father's name to get work. This wasn't the case. If you could do the work, Petrie would have taken you to work there. But the issue is that we don't have her name. We know that she worked on this site. We don't have many of the names of the Egyptian people who worked for Petrie. This is a real issue, and it's an issue that we've kind of put front and center in the new entrance gallery. I'm going to move very quickly, very nearly finished now. We're also telling the story of ancient Sudan in the entrance gallery, which is a very important part of the collection. We have around 4,000 objects from Sudan, and this story hasn't been told before in the Petrie Museum entrance gallery. We have created a series of illustrations of some of the characters whose stories are now represented in the entrance gallery, including me. I didn't choose to have this, I should say, but we are developing a visitor trail using these illustrations to be able to spill these stories into the museum itself and tell the stories of these people around the museum spaces. I'm going to move on past this one, and just to highlight that some of our future plans include following up on more of our physical access audit recommendations, as well as intellectual access from some of our key stakeholders, which includes pursuing more Arabic translations of museum interpretation, bilingual translation, which we're hoping to present with these character trails. Also looking forward towards more meaningful community collaborations. The project won't end here. We're hoping that it's really just the start of something that we can continue in the future, particularly when we're looking at our permanent interpretation. And this also includes events with colleagues in Egypt, where we're able to zoom in now because of this wonderful technology, and get their feedback, get their make sure that they feel like they're part of the development of the Petrie Museum, as they should be. So that is me. It's a very quick run through. Thank you so much for having me. I could give a day-long lecture about that, which I won't because I've already run over. But thank you so much, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Anna. Next up, we've got Anna Yanase de Rezende with the paper Cultural Identity and Repatriation. You might have noticed that we sent a link out in advance of Anna Julia's presentation, and we'll pop that in the chat again now, along with a link to Mentimeter as well. Anna Julia has also asked that if people are comfortable, if they could turn on their camera during her presentation, and she may ask questions or ask participation. So anyone who's comfortable to turn on their camera, please do so now. And I will now put myself on mute. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma and Victoria. Thank you for this amazing congress, all your support as well. So hello everybody. Good to see you all. Thank you. I feel much more comfortable when I can see you all. Thank you. So yeah, off you go. So this topic, and I'm counting on your participation. Yes, it's about cultural identity and repatriations. So before we start the debate and the whole dynamic, I need to pass through some concepts. Yes. When we talked about repatriation, we also talked about three different terms. Yes, and this is something much more related of formalities, I think. Yes. Repatriation and the concept itself is the process by which cultural objects are returned to a nation or a state, yes, as requested. But they also use the term restitution, right, which is the same idea, same process, yes. And the last synonym, which is return, which came to be used in negotiations because it was considered less aggressive terms toward all the parts. Yes. So I start with an introduction, bringing the Article 7 of the Human Rights for the Future Generations, which is the right to the conservation and transmission of cultural property as a common heritage of humanity. Yes. So when we talk about this process of giving back one artifact or one object, a cultural object, cultural heritage, we are allowing it this possibility to create a new story. Yes, so it's this possibility that a new story can be told, which I think it's amazing, right? Because there isn't a single version of the story, right? It's always multiple versions of the same one. So yeah, off you go. Let's talk about repatriation in practice. So that's when I'm counting on your participation, okay? So Emma shared one link with you guys to a Padlet, yes? And I would gently ask you to access this link, please. Yeah, so we can continue from there. Let me share the Padlet itself. I don't know if you have ever used Padlet before, but it's quite, it's fairly friendly platform. Let me help you and guide you through this platform here, yeah? So let's take a look at 3 cases here. Yes, all of them in South America. And why is that? Because I'm from South America, yes? And it's much easier to understand and talk about our, well, the community we are involved with, yeah? So we have case number 1 here, number 2, number 3, yes? You can scroll down here and you can take a look at the description of what happened with every single object here, yes? And what I'm expecting you guys to do is to give your opinion on the solution of every single one of these situations. Yes, what happened here? If the repatriation happens or does not, or how would you approach this object if you have to create an exhibition about that? Would you? For you to add a comment, you just have to click here, right here, and you can add your comment. Yes. And you can post it either as an anonymous or you can put your name on it, feel comfortable about it, okay? And all of time, I'm going to give you 5 minutes for this exercise. And also, if it's too difficult, I mean, for you to handle with the platform, because sometimes happens, or if it's not working, you can answer that by using our chat, okay? Yeah, so off we go. 5 minutes is starting from now. Yeah. Oh, so we have a comment here. Thank you. The first case here, case 1. Thank you. 1 minute left, guys. Some really nice comments here. Thank you. Excellent, open, respectful dialogue with the community to understand the point of view. Okay. Sort the conversation about symbolize different people. Okay, definitely need to respect and sensible power, virtual objects, open dialogue to solve repatriation. Amazing. Make sure there's full parts of the biography of this object. Excellent. Here return to the place they were discovered. Case 3, case 2. Oh, this is an interesting comment. Interesting that this is an object. Okay. Hands up, guys, thank you. Let me tell you what happened to each one of those objects. Yeah, shall we? Am I sharing my presentation? Yeah?
Yeah, we can see it, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So this is the first one. What happened was the community, one of the communities asked for this axe, which is placed in one of the most important museums in Brazil. They decided to repatriate this object, considering this is more like a ritual and spiritual object than something that gives them the identity of their own community, right? And what the museum did was keeping a replica of the on their storage, yes. But more than that, they're starting a conversation with this community. So they built together the curatorial practice along the whole collection, which I think it's a very nice and a huge step here, right? The second one, this one is from Paraguay, asked Brazils to give them back this cannons and so on. Well, Brazil said, okay, so I'm going to give this back to you, but unfortunately I have like a tons of paperwork before I'm delivering the cannon on your country, so it will take some time and we can wait. Yeah, I suppose you can wait. And it took more or less like 5 years to go through all the paperwork to give this cannon back. And at the last step, which is collecting signatures from our president and so on, the process just stopped. It was just like a huge pause there. And a few years later, well, as I told you guys, this cannon here, it's placed in the National Museum in Rio. I don't know if you're aware with, but 2018, this museum was consumed by fire, yes, and the cannon's there. So the question here is, what we are talking about? Are we talking about culture? Are we talking about like, okay, so how can we preserve and our cultural heritage, or we are talking about political interests, domination? Yes, and this small and this object here is just like the small part of this curse which is behind the object. Yeah, so this is one aspect that I want you to think about it. Yeah, because it's not that evident. Maybe for us that we work for, or for you guys that work with curatorial process, museums, and are like into this media and communities and so on. But for my parents, for example, they do not really have this idea of, okay, so am I talking about the repatriation, or am I talking about like political agreements? What is the big topic here? Yeah. And the last one, which is from Peru, Ecuador and Peru. Those objects was found right at the border. And yes, they were repatriated at this moment. Peru and Ecuador, they have a very friendly relationship, yes, between countries. They shared a lot. The communities, they're very, very strong and structured communities, yes, indigenous communities especially. So yes, the objects were repatriated, and then they started museums started to work together to create one curatorial collaboration between countries, and also a very nice exhibition around those objects. Yeah. So this is mainly the resolution of every case study here. And why did I brought this topics here, right? To ask you guys, what role am I playing in strengthening the cultural identity in my community? Am I like positively thinking about that? Am I aware of all this concepts and all this sometimes other interests that are behind the object itself? So you have the mentee here, and I want, if you feel comfortable about it, share your ideas with us. Yes, if it's not, and if you want to do this self-reflection on your own, which is also fine, go ahead. Yeah. After that, I was wondering, okay, so what we're supposed to do? Yes, because there isn't, when we talk about repatriation, cultural heritage, and I think the most important aspect here is that we create these bridges, yes, between the part which is requesting and the part to have the object itself, yes, but mainly to consider that research, education, like more like museum education and curatorial practice must work together, yes, so we can achieve much better results with that, right? And lastly, that the act of repatriation can play a fundamental role in the formation of an identity or a nation, yes. Also that heritage plays a fundamental role not only as an asset, but also as a political instrument. So being aware of that and think about your responsibility, right, as a person who communicates, who create bridges, who create this possibility to all the communities tell their own stories, yes, because there is never a single history, never a single side of a history, yes, and people want to be heard, yes, and we want to listen from you as well, right? I think this space for conversation is the most important, because at the end, histories can be used to empower people, empower communities, repair and healing. Yes, and that's it. Thank you so much. It's a very short time. Hopefully, can hear more from a lot new questions and so on later. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to pass over to Laurie now for the next Q&A session.
Let me just get this. Hello everyone. If we haven't had many questions, if you think of any, please do put them in the chat now. So Anna, I think you did answer this in the chat, but maybe if you could speak to it as well so that other people can have a chance to hear about it. And this was a question from Fiona Poole asking Anna, how do you incorporate everything that you were talking about in your presentation into your catalogue records? Particularly, do you have a methodology of flagging items with negative language or descriptions? And yeah, can you maybe just reiterate what you said in the chat so that everyone can hear that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you, Fiona, for your question. It's a very good one. So in terms of, I suppose, practicalities, we're about to launch a new online catalogue and this is for all of UCL museums. And as part of that online catalogue, it's not live quite yet, otherwise I'd share a link. We've included a sentence, I don't have it on here, but underneath, to give users the opportunity to contact us if they'd like to flag a particular object with relating to kind of racist language or these kind of contested, controversial histories. That is, I suppose, one way in which we'd like to receive feedback from a proactive perspective, from a kind of curatorial perspective. I've been working, one thing I didn't get to say because I ran far too far over, is that we've been working with some of the master students at UCL to develop the catalogue entries for the objects in the entrance gallery, to include much more detail about their background and their histories. And one idea that Fiona mentioned actually in a private message, I hope it's okay that I say this, is the idea of kind of tagging records with colonial object or racist language or something like this, which I think is a fantastic idea. In terms of practicality, I'm not sure how that would work for us, our collections database, but I'd be very happy to take that back to the team to discuss it in our documentation group meetings. I think that's a fantastic idea. With where it relates to objects and their link with eugenics, in particular Petrie's support of eugenics, I think that would be more straightforward to tag those objects. But as I mentioned to Fiona, if we use kind of colonial object as a tag, it would be pretty much 99.9% of the collection. So it's, but that doesn't mean to say we shouldn't flag them as being colonial. But it's how we make that clear, I suppose, to users of the catalogue. But again, thank you for asking it. That's a fantastic question. I hope that helps.
Great, thank you, Anna. And just a small, as soon as I've got everyone here, I know particularly the documentation side of things is something a lot of museums have been talking about recently, and we have started running, I can't remember what we're calling it, I think colonial heritage sort of Zoom session, but basically having spaces where museum professionals can meet and just kind of discuss these kinds of potentially difficult to, get to grips with practical side of things with each other. And those Zooms are something we're going to be running every couple of months, open to non-members as well as members. So keep an eye out on your email lists if that's something you might be interested in, kind of more just a support space for anyone working in anything they might like to discuss with other people. So hopefully that might be of use to some people.
Thank you.
Great. We have had a slightly more light-hearted question for you, Julia, which is, did the cannon survive the fire?
Yes, actually, yes. And unfortunately, well, the Brazilian government never proceeded with the repatriation itself. And something which is really interesting about this, I use the word interesting, but it's, I don't know if it's the right word, yes, about this, what happened to this museum is that, well, this is the oldest science museum in Brazil, yes. They have a huge catalogue about indigenous languages and also communities that no longer exist. Also about this moment in Brazil, which we live in a dictatorship, right? Is it the correct word? And well, it happens that just these two main sectors were affected. The one about our indigenous people and this one about the whole collection about this moment in our history, right? Dictatorship. And this is the question. If we have no evidence that something happens, and one moment of the history, if we stop talking about that, it would be still like existing or no longer exist, right? So this is like a tricky question for me. But yeah, at the end, well, the canon, yes, survived, but unfortunately, the Brazilian government never proceeded with repatriation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I wonder, this may be my technical issues, but from the Mentimeter, it hasn't popped up with different people's kind of responses to that. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about the kind of things you've had through there? Sort of responses to the question.
Sure. Let me share Menti here. Here, off you go. We shared the link if someone else wants to participate. Here we go. This, and here's the code. Off you go. Being aware of the importance of language, using inclusive language as a normal thing. Exactly that. Define the language, you help large organizations and how process can create a culture of thinking, taking into account. Amazing. Yeah, isn't it? It can help to highlight and understand multiple. Exactly. And this is on the last one, this last comment here, that organizations can help to highlight and understand multiple identities that make up a community. Indeed. And this is directly related with this idea of creating spaces, so we can tell our history and listen to others, right? Because there isn't, as I told you before, never a single side of a history. And I think like being heard and listen to others can help us like improve, isn't it?
Right, definitely. Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, we haven't had any further questions at this point. I'm sure that if you think of anything later on, our speakers will be around in the chat, or if they have to dash off, we can always feed things to them. So I think that probably means we can go a little earlier for break. If Victoria, this is your side of things.
Yeah, good news. A longer break. So yeah, if everyone can aim to be back for 3:20. We've got 2 more papers and a Q&A before the end of today. So yes, if you can join us again at 15:20, that'd be much appreciated. So hopefully see you in just under half an hour then. Thank you. Hi again, everyone. I hope you had a nice break there. Maybe had a chance to grab a cup of tea or coffee. So we'll just maybe make a start now with our last couple of sessions for this afternoon. So first up, we've got Stuart Frost and Pierrette Squires with their paper Reactions to the Desire, Love, Identity, Exploring LGBTQ Histories exhibition. So I'll pass over to them now. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to have a chance to present at the conference today. So thank you for the opportunity. Hopefully everyone can now see the PowerPoint slides.
Yes, we can see them.
Yep. Okay, great. Desire of Identities, Exploring LGBTQ Histories was an exhibition at the British Museum in 2017 that was then adapted, and it subsequently travelled to 5 other museums around England. And that's going to be obviously the focus for our presentation today. And actually the bulk of the presentation is going to be on the exhibition when it was at Bolton. So I'm going to hand over to Pierrette shortly. But basically, I'm just going to give a short introduction to the project as a whole, just to set the scene, provide a bit of background. So I'll talk a little bit about the origins of the display at the British Museum, and then the subsequent tour, and then I'll hand over to Pierrette, and we'll sort of zoom in a bit with a very specific case study. So just to get started, the project began really, the inspiration for it was this book, A Little Gay History, Desire and Diversity Across the World, which was written in 2013 by a former colleague at the British Museum, Professor Richard Parkinson. And it's a brilliant book, which basically focuses on 40 objects from the museum's collection from around the world, from deep history to the present day. So it's a global history. And it is a fantastic book and resource. And basically the book was published in 2013, and it provided the inspiration for ongoing work, really. And probably about 2015, a former colleague of mine, Laura Phillips, who was head of community partnerships, and myself, I was head of interpretation, we put a proposal together to do an exhibition at the British Museum using the book as inspiration to mark the 50th anniversary of the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality in England and Wales, which the anniversary was July 2017. And so the proposal was accepted, and Richard very kindly agreed to be an advisor on the exhibition. And there were two parts to the exhibition, really. So it sort of took the wide scope of the book, deep history to the present day, trying to include all parts of the collection. There were two parts to the exhibition. There was a focused exhibition in a temporary exhibition space, one of the smaller spaces in the museum, but it was the one that we were allocated for the display. And then there was a trail, which I'll talk about in a minute or two. And basically this whole exhibition was highly collaborative. So like nominally, Laura and I sort of co-curated it, but really I think our job was to channel enthusiasm from colleagues across the museum and so on. And basically we did do a call out across the museum to ask any member of staff who was interested in helping shape the exhibition to get involved. And we ran a number of workshops with staff, so not just curatorial staff, anyone who was interested. We worked with various community partners who we'd had long-standing relationships with, and the title for the exhibition came out of conversations with community partners. And we had external advisors and academics who read the texts and gave us feedback at various key points. So very collaborative, and lots of thank yous owed to lots of people. So yeah, basically the part of the exhibition that you can see here is focused on recent acquisitions, contemporary works that have been acquired in the last sort of 5 years or so by the museum. And the other side of the display was more historic, looking at a longer history of LGBTQ histories in Europe from the ancient world to the present day. And the show, very positive feedback generally, a lot of positive feedback from visitors in terms of the visitor figures. They're a bit higher than usual for exhibitions in the display space, so it was great. We made use of every bit of space that we had, but what we were really keen to do with the exhibition was to try and create a dispersed exhibition where basically people, we hoped, would start their visit maybe in here. They'd pick up a trail leaflet in the exhibition space, and then they'd head out into the galleries to look at 15 different objects that were already on display that had really interesting stories to tell, and to explore those objects out in the galleries. So I guess we were hoping that in total, if people did everything, it might take them about 90 minutes, 2 hours, something like that. So that's how it was conceived anyway. And then here's one example of one of the trail objects. The Warren Cup is a Roman cup, wine cup. And you can see here it's temporarily highlighted with expanded interpretation. So there's slightly bigger word count to say a bit more about the object itself. And then there's a text to talk a little bit more about the cultural context of attitudes in ancient Rome. And as I say, there was a trail leaflet to take people around the galleries to look at objects like this. But we also hoped that people would come across these objects by accident, and it would sort of hook them in, and sort of interpretation by stealth type of thing. We did put some objects out on display temporarily where they were light sensitive things. So here's some Japanese woodblock prints known as shunga. They're light sensitive, so it couldn't be on permanent display. We had to rotate them, but the curators were great at helping us pick works and make space for them in the permanent galleries. But anyway, in October 2017, the exhibition sadly came to an end, and that meant the trail interpretation had to come down too. And we were really keen to create a lasting legacy to the project. So we thought really hard about that when we set the project up. And one of the things we did was update all of the labels across the museum to try and make sure that they were still highlighted and that the texts talked about the LGBTQ aspect. We created a Google Cultural Institute site so people could still access the longer texts if they wanted to read them. We created an audio tour. So the vinyl interpretation, you can see, was quite long. And we obviously couldn't fit that into the conventional label. So we created an audio tour and there's a commentary for each of those objects that's sort of like 3 to 4 minutes. So people can listen to the story, and it's a trail leaflet which people can download from the website to help them navigate between the stops on the trail. We created volunteer-led LGBTQ tours, and lots of people helped with those, including Dan Vo, of course. We launched them in July 2019, and they've been going from strength to strength. They've actually just restarted following the pandemic. And finally, last but not least, was the touring exhibition. So thanks to the support of the Dorset Foundation, we were able to develop a touring version of the exhibition, the expanded object list. And then that exhibition travelled to 4 venues initially, the Ashmolean in Oxford, and Richard Parkinson had moved to Oxford, so he was involved here, which was great. It was lovely to work with Richard again. The National Justice Museum in Nottingham. In each venue, the exhibition was slightly different. It spoke to their own collection and context in really great ways. Bolton looked amazing. You're going to find out more about that in a moment. And then finally, the exhibition went to Norwich Millennium Library, where it had a really big impact because it was in such an open space. So many people walked through it, encountered it. That was brilliant. And then just at the end, as we were coming towards the end of the tour, another venue got in touch who was interested in taking the exhibition. And that was the Shire Hall Historic Courthouse in Dorset, and we were able to take the exhibition there, which was fantastic. But now I'm going to hand over to Pierrette, and she's going to talk to you a little bit more about Bolton.
Hi, can everybody hear me?
I can hear you.
I could just see you, Stuart, so I wasn't sure. Bolton, as you'll have seen in the tiny numbers above on the previous slide Stuart was just showing, that was visitor figures. So we had over 23,000 visitors for the sort of 10 weeks the exhibition was with us, which is huge for us. That was really brilliant numbers. And I think a core part of that was, and I suppose answering one of the questions that we were asked to answer with these presentations, was about community involvement. So I think part of the reason that our numbers were so high was because from the start, and in fact even before the exhibition, we were really actively embedding the local community in all of our planning. So a little bit of background. The next slide, please. The LGBT community in Bolton, I don't know how many of you know much about it, but it had been one of the sort of least supported and most discriminated against in the country, even legislatively, right up until quite recent times. So Bolton was the last place in the UK to convict gay men before the age of consent was equalised. And that only happened in 1997. So, you know, when we were looking at this exhibition, this was within active living memory of a lot of the community in the town. So from 2015, we'd been doing a lot of very gentle, gradual work, trying to get some support, but also really for the staff as well, because a lot of people were so scared, and not just to out themselves if they're part of that community, but even to voice support because the discrimination had been so extreme. So we'd been doing some gradual work on this, and we'd been starting to think about ways of having some sort of an exhibition. And for us, the British Museum, the partnership with that exhibition was perfect timing, because we had a few things in the collections, but nothing really that could set Bolton's history in the sort of world and time context of broader LGBTQ histories. So that was really what we were hoping to do, and I hope you'll see sort of what we achieved with it. So probably, I guess, 2/3 of the exhibition at Bolton was the British Museum content, and about 1/3 was Bolton and more recent things. So part of that, again, similarly, we had a trail. So we'd developed an LGBTQ trail when we reopened the museum in 2018. So there were already some collections dotted around that people could see, but it wasn't kind of created with a huge amount of fanfare. It was just part of our inclusive work as we opened up, to sort of have that gradual practice of better inclusion and just people getting used to the fact this was what was happening. One of the things that was really great for us as part of this sort of planning was we worked with the Proud Trust, and we trained all of our staff, or just about all, the ones that could attend, in LGBTQ kind of awareness, things like explaining to front of house staff how to be sensitive around what pronouns to use for people, that kind of thing. And what that meant was that the staff were much more comfortable with just being in that space and speaking to people, a lot of whom weren't originally, even if they were part of that community, because of the background in Bolton. So next slide, please. The academic community, also, we had never really connected with from the point of view of LGBTQ things before within our collections. One of the things that we had been doing, and we'd started it probably a couple of years before, was our database had the ability to flag objects with status flags, like a lot of databases do. So I'd asked my team to create status flags for all of the different sort of protected characteristics. And it was very ad hoc, but it was a beginning of inclusive practice. And what it meant was when somebody came across something that happened to represent somebody or thought it did, we flagged it, which just meant if somebody came to us and said, do you have any, whatever the thing was, objects representing disabled people, then you could click that flag and see. And it also meant you could click multiple flags and see intersectionality. So that work had been done. But as I said, it had been very ad hoc. Now, as part of this exhibition, we worked closely with Lois Stone, who was doing their PhD at Manchester University. And Lois came and worked with us to help identify more LGBT-related items to add on to this status flags. And the collection database has gone from 100 plus to over 300 items during that time. And again, what that means is that's another part of the community that's been actively involved. It's raised consciousness of what collections we have. And it also meant we were looking to build object lists ready for the exhibition. So it did a whole bunch of things. Next slide, please. So I have the advantage, I guess, within this exhibition that I'm a member of this community. So I already chair Bolton's LGBT Partnership, which is a sort of stakeholder group, bringing all the different community groups and things together. So I knew some of the individuals really well. So it meant I had a good sort of in for connecting with that community. And one of the things we wanted to do with the exhibition was not just to display objects the community had donated in traditional ways, but we also wanted to give the community a space that they could do whatever they wanted with. So they really felt that ownership, and we weren't going to put sort of normal curatorial parameters on it. So that one, we had some of our display places included things that they had donated, and we worked with some of them to look at what text would go to interpret it. But also you can see in the image on the right, there's a notice board. And that notice board, local community groups just produced a whole bunch of stuff to go on it. We didn't edit it, we didn't censor it, and they actually produced too much, and we ended up swapping things over during the time. And what it meant was those individuals felt like the gallery was part of their space. A lot of them weren't academic. A lot of them had never had anything really to do with writing things or creating stuff for a display before. And they loved it. And it really meant that they felt this was part of their work. And it wasn't just us giving something to them or writing something about them. The people you can see in the photograph are members of the local community. And again, they were incredibly involved. So the lady in the rainbow stripy dungarees is called Rosie. She's a writer and she wrote a play as part of the exhibition. We had a number of plays. Steve, who's sat in the middle, helped to collect a lot of things from his community group. So yeah, really very, very active involvement with the local community. We had national LGBTQ events. So the next slide, please. We had a really packed events program. We've been an Outing the Past hub for LGBT History Month for the last few years. And that included sort of national performers and speakers. So you can see Sasha Coward there, you can see Rosie Garland. And those people coming in also drew in some of the community who perhaps wouldn't have come into the museum and gallery space initially, or wouldn't necessarily have come to Bolton. We had people coming from all over. Again, sort of raising that involvement and that awareness. Then if we look at the exhibition, next slide, please. So this was the space you're looking at. In the far distance, you can see a rainbow archway that was the entrance to the exhibition that people came through. And behind me, there's a sort of little indented space, which was very much more the cozy community area. And people, there were bean bags there and people hung out and relaxed and kind of really owned the space. So next slide, please. And this is what some teenagers said to me one day when I walked through the gallery. I spent a lot of time in that space. To go from Bolton having the highest hate crime rates for LGBT people in the country in 2015 to having a comment like, this feels like the safest space to be in Bolton from youngsters, was just amazing. And when we think about the things that sort of protected me during that time, looking after my own health and well-being, it was focusing on this impact that it was having for the individuals. Next slide, please. So we also connected with some local authors. So this was Matt Kane, who hadn't really been back to Bolton as part of the queer community that much until the exhibition. And since then, he's been very, very involved with writing workshops and that kind of thing. And it really helped him feel a sense of ownership of the town. So finally, legacy. And the next slide, please. So it was hugely successful. And as part of it, we now have a chill out zone for Bolton Pride every year. As you can see, that same group of teenagers that felt it was the safest space come back and hang out in this sort of space that we create. People come in when it's not an LGBT event. I see the same individuals coming for things like theatre events in the museum, where they obviously feel this is part of their space to be and to stay. So in conclusion, next slide, please. Embedding queer histories in all areas of museum, library and archive practice raises visibility, reduces isolation for individuals, creates valuable education resources, improves long-term access to our collections, and above all, enables members of the queer community to feel at home in our cultural institutions. Leading on from this, we're now taking this sort of community approach into our next community engagement projects. So we're looking at one to tackle better inclusion for things like for groups like refugees and asylum seekers, and some of our immigrant communities in Bolton who are not currently well represented in the museum. So this kind of wholly inclusive approach is the way we're moving forwards. That's it, thank you.
Thanks very much, Stuart and Pierrette. We've now got our last speaker of the day, Helen Antrobus, with a paper entitled Reflecting on the Challenging Histories programme, marking 3 major anniversaries on LGBTQ+ histories, women and protest and radical action. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can all hear me okay. I can't believe I have to follow that. That was fantastic. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking about the Challenging Histories programme at the National Trust. So my name is Helen Antrobus. I was previously the programme curator at National Programmes. I'm now the Assistant National Curator of Cultural Landscapes. And yeah, I think when we put this paper in, it was a long time ago. And so reflecting back over something that happened 18 months ago and then 3 years before that as well has been really interesting. And it's amazing kind of having looked back to see how much of that learning we brought forward. And that's really what I wanted to focus on today with talking about the Challenging Histories programme. So the programme was developed by curator Rachel Lennon in 2016 and 2017 as a 3-year programme designed to celebrate 3 major upcoming anniversaries at the time. So 2017, we had a programme called Prejudice and Pride, marking 50 years since the partial decriminalisation of homosexual acts. In 2018, we had a programme called Women in Power, marking 100 years since the Representation of the People Act, when some women were able to vote for the first time. And 2019, we had People's Landscapes, which commemorated 200 years since the Peterloo Massacre. So these anniversaries are of national significance, and actually I would go as far as to say 3 important moments and turning points in how a lot of heritage organisations and a lot of cultural institutions in our sector commemorated and understood how to commemorate undertold and often marginalised histories. Now, when I joined the National Trust in the kind of national public programmes role, I was really surprised. I wasn't surprised a few months in, but why they'd kind of named it the Challenging Histories programme, why that kind of challenge, because I'd previously worked at the People's History Museum in Manchester, where the sort of histories that the National Trust wanted to talk about in this programme was our bread and butter. That was our collection. And I didn't really see the challenge in curating it or telling those stories. But the National Trust is not one museum. As an organisation, we look after 780 miles of coastline, 250,000 hectares of land, and over 500 heritage properties, which include historic houses, gardens, industrial monuments, and social history sites. So with such a breadth of places and such a range of histories, of course, it's quite challenging to tell stories that might be outside of the traditional and outside of the identity of the National Trust. But this felt like a really pertinent moment for the National Trust with these anniversaries to kind of hook into to research, bring to light these stories. So I'm going to speak today, like I said, just about the legacies that came from this 3-year programme. I wasn't actually at the organisation for Prejudice and Pride, so today I'll mainly be focusing on talking about women in power and people's landscapes. So what was the National Public Programme and what were its aims? So the aims of the National Public Programme, it was a year-long cultural programme bringing together sort of narratives relevant to each theme, and each theme was inspired by the anniversary. However, we broadened these out, so as I gave the names, it wasn't the anniversary of or marking 50 years since, it was women in power and people's landscapes and prejudice and pride, because we didn't want properties to kind of be restricted by their kind of story that was already in place. We wanted them to connect to stories about women's histories, stories about protest and action. We wanted properties to use this as an opportunity to programme around narratives that felt relevant and perhaps before they hadn't had the confidence nor seen the moment to seize to tell these stories. So with that, our aims were to increase the relevance and resonance National Trust to people's lives today, to position the National Trust as a national voice and facilitator of contemporary debate around place and identity, and to introduce cultural heritage and nature to new audiences and deepen connections for existing audiences. Now, looking after so many places and properties can mean it does become sporadic. As I mentioned just now, each place does have its own identity and tells its own story. So MPP was a way to bring in a theme and bring together social histories of these places under one banner. Challenging and marginalised histories in themselves challenge both staff and visitors to see the National Trust, which can sometimes have a collective identity as somewhere for traditional or safe histories in a different light, but bringing forward LGBTQ plus and women's histories as well as working class histories and stories and protests actually contradicted this image. This just isn't the case. That it's not that these stories don't exist in these places, it's just that they hadn't really been surfaced or had light shone on them in the same way before. And you know, I think the biggest aim that really struck me and felt important to me was that one about relevance and resonance. And these stories, they're not in the past, they're very much central to our lives today. From groups like Extinction Rebellion, which have been making news this week, to the Me Too movement. These are all issues that impact the world we live in, and every day we're seeing history being made in the actions of people speaking out on these subjects. So what the National Public Programme did wasn't just centering or shining a light on historic stories, it was centering contemporary stories and voices, which came through in the sort of exhibitions, events, digital content, and the partnerships that were created and curated. So what did it do? What was the legacy? Well, it made us part of a national conversation. All of these anniversaries were, of course, nationally significant, but Prejudice and Pride, which was the first sort of year of national programming, focused on around 11 properties and stories. But once the success of that programme and showing how many new audiences and people it engaged, showing what a difference it made, being part of this national conversation, that sort of changed. And for Women in Power, we had nearly 90 properties and places wanting to be part of the programme. So the scale grew massively. As our properties began to see the benefits. It also gave an opportunity to plan ahead, to plan programming. By seeing a theme for each year, they were able to get their ducks in a row and start research early, start thinking about how they could engage with certain themes, and actually start to look into their collection to unearth or, you know, tell something that they already knew was there but hadn't had an opportunity to do before. So the programme did grow between 2017 to 2018. Women in Power alone, we had 3 million visitors to the exhibition and events that were showcased as part of that cultural programme. But being part of national conversation, that felt really important because the National Trust hadn't really done that before in the way that it was all under one banner or talking about one theme, which is a surprise considering it is one of the few organisations with a national reach. We have properties extensively in Wales, in Northern Ireland and in England. And the exciting part of this is that both the contemporary issues and historic narrative that we were surfacing through research, through conversations with properties, and linking to these kind of big themes, even though they were all really nationally relevant, they differed by region and by place. So no two places were the same or told exactly the same story. But for the first time, they were speaking to each other. So property in the Midlands might have had a similar suffrage story to one in the Northeast. And for the first time, you know, we were sort of seeing iterations of both stories kind of crossing and research crossing over. And interventions and exhibitions began to kind of look similar. They were all on a theme, and they were all kind of, speaking to each other. So for example, the story of women told at Belton House in the Midlands through interventions that explored the women of the property through their artistic skills. So they had fantastic embroiderers and watercolorists, and that was how they kind of framed their Women in Power exhibition, by showing that these women showed their emotions and told their own stories, not necessarily through letters and books, through their needlework and through their artistic skills. Now that really differed from how the story of women was told at Dunham Massey, where female artists from around Greater Manchester were invited to join a temporary exhibition throughout the house and create an artwork for each woman who had been part of the house's past, with each artwork kind of responding to sort of different emotional story of these women, often where there were sort of no archival objects to show for that woman. So even though they were sort of different stories, they were bringing in this kind of use of art and actually finding really unique ways to tell a woman's story, when, as we know, in many cases, women's histories and women's archival collections haven't been saved. So it was this very clever way of programming, and it was through kind of the support offered through the programming team of funding and research that we were able to do this. Similarly, the national reach of the NT allowed us to be at the heart of a lot of activities. So, for example, in the People's Landscapes programme, which was a response to the Peterloo massacre, allowed us to focus much of our activity in Manchester and to champion a heritage capital outside of London. In many ways, MPP enabled these kind of regional histories to be centralised and to become part of a national conversation whilst engaging with other cultural organisations. So that through this, the programme became a call and response between properties and places. There was shared research, shared events, and also properties was beginning to build regional networks of their own based upon these new histories that they were surfacing. And I've said that, you know, the National Trust enabled a lot of this to happen. I don't know whether that is the right language, because we were able to do all this by being part of a cohort of cultural places telling similar stories. This was a sort of happy failure in 2018 with the Women in Power programme, when we put together an unsuccessful bid to the government's fairly hastily pulled together centenary fund with other national and regional organisations. And although we come together to put together a massive and very ambitious bid to kind of bring together and actually kind of tie together all the cultural activity that was going on around sort of centenary of the Representation of People Act, even though we couldn't do that, it wasn't possible anymore, we still saw support network growth from that, and we were able to, again, as properties were doing, we as organisations were able to host events with each other, workshops, and support each other through our research. So I think one of the biggest things that came from that is that as one of the legacies is that kind of cohort of national organisations still exists today. We're still always talking, we're still sharing what our programming will be and what we're looking forward to, what anniversaries we might be marking. That's kind of been a bit disrupted because of COVID, but those kind of relationships we made, because we were all sort of looking to tell the same story, have remained intact. And it's just a smattering of some of the activity that happened across the country around women in power and people's landscapes. But one of the biggest legacies, and I think one of the most significant legacies of the National Public Programme, is thinking about research. So research grew throughout the National Public Programme planning from so many different places, from academic partnerships, on-property, staff and volunteer-led research groups. This kind of programme and the sort of need to research gave an agency for staff and volunteers to kind of create, sometimes in many properties, new and formalised patterns of research. And I will touch upon that later. But the key thing here was our academic partnerships. We knew that to talk about these, as they were titled, challenging histories, we needed to really think about the relevance and resonance with our places, and we needed to show that these were relevant to our places. We weren't just trying to kind of cling on to an anniversary that didn't mean something to us. So our academic partnerships put a strong research and voice of research, behind our stories, and really embedded them and actually kind of gave them a lot of strength and weight. We had already had an academic partnership with the University of Oxford. It's a partnership that's still in place, that's funded until 2023, I believe. And it was designed to kind of research across the whole of the National Trust, which it still does. But it was really crucial for national public programmes from the early iterations of the programme and shaping it and kind of helping us to identify where stories were, which places we needed to focus on, what we wanted to put in things like our guidebook even. You know, we had really strong relationships with academics who were able to point us in the right direction. Particularly for Women in Power and People's Landscapes, Women in Power, we worked really closely in the early stages with Dr. Sophie Duncan, who created a research pack for us that spanned across, the whole of our properties. And similarly, in 2019, we worked with Jenna Ashton, who did the same for us, looking at kind of where there had been protest and radical action in our landscapes and in our spaces across all of our places. And not only were they kind of there in those key moments of forming the programme and identifying where these stories were most prominent, but they also helped us with the end reflections. We had conference, Women in Power, Regions in Balance, which really sought to look at how women's histories had been told throughout 2018 and what the next steps were. And also we had a seminar series through 2019 focusing on kind of the past, present, future of radical and political landscapes with partners. And it really allowed us, by having this sort of already established partnership with the University of Oxford, we knew that each programme wasn't going to be the same, that it would have different formulas, and the partnership really allowed us to create a menu that we could scale up or down, what sort of support we needed, and we really recognised the differences we might need for each programme. So, for example, with Women in Power, a lot of our kind of symposiums and conferences and kind of sharing our research, starting our research, started with women's history and historic debate and what we were looking at in the past. Whereas with 2019 and our People's Landscape programme, that was a lot more about kind of contemporary action and kind of the voices of today and how sort of what happened 200 years ago really was still going on. So there was a kind of crucial difference in sort of what kind of voices and what sort of stories we were sort of sharing throughout, and our partnership allowed us to bring in the best of those voices and the most interesting where we might have not been able to look. It was confidence building, I think, particularly after the, as many of you might have seen, the complaints we received in a lot of certain press outlets. We needed to build confidence. We needed to root our research, our reasons for doing this, in kind of, have that kind of academic strength behind it. Throughout the programme as well, they offered us kind of opportunities for more research. So, for example, we had micro internship students that came in and research smaller pockets of kind of histories and collections that there might not have been the opportunity to do so before, all kind of pertaining to the theme of the programme. We held, like I say, symposiums, conferences, and we also were able to kind of get some new opportunities. So, for example, we set up KTP fellowships, looking at imperialism and suffrage at the National Trust, and we were also able to work with the Oxford Dictionary of National Biographies through our partnership to kind of tell us to really kind of get the story of some of these women. We'd surfaced Women in Power onto ODNB so that research has a different legacy in a different place beyond the National Trust. But research also created opportunities and new processes at properties. The incredible work led by Dr. Ben Wilcox in the North region set up a cross-property volunteer research group between Gunman Massey and Corriebank Mill, both in Cheshire, to explore connections of two sides of the Petrie massacre. So we were really, I don't know whether the word is lucky, but it was good for us that we had these two very different properties, an old mill and a stately home that were literally on two sides of this conflict, what happened to the Petrie massacre. So the Earl of Stamford of Gunman Massey had signed off the Cheshire Yeomanry charge in St. Peter's Fields, where the protesters demanding reform were gathered peacefully. But the Greggs, who owned Corriebank Mill, were sympathisers and acted as witnesses in the inquests and subsequent kind of fallout of the massacre. So the research group, which was made for volunteers, and we got Dr. Kayla Hume, who was at Manchester Metropolitan University at the time, to come in and kind of build a research process for volunteers, which wasn't just happening in our own archive, going out to other cultural institutions like John Rylands Library, like Central Library in Manchester as well. And by connecting the sort of volunteer group, it took them along on the process. I think I've heard quite a lot in today's talks of that sort of really important if you're talking about these slightly marginalised or challenging histories, the importance of bringing volunteers along with you. And this put them right at the heart of action. They were doing the research, they were working really closely on it, and they were having the opportunity to have very consistent meetings to share that, to showcase it to broader, not just to their property teams, but beyond. And that was the power of the programme, I think. It's setting up these fantastic opportunities for staff and volunteer alike, to connect not only to other places in the National Trust, but beyond the National Trust as well. And their research was actually put into an exhibition at Manchester Central Library as part of Manchester Histories Festival, marking the bicentenary of Peterloo. So research has time and time again shown to be at the fore of every curator's work, but now it was beyond that. It was for everyone who engaged with our histories and showcased the relevance of our histories and showcased, how relevant our histories were in completely new ways. It benefited new audiences. Audience was coming to our places and saying they didn't know that this happened at the National Trust, or they wouldn't have expected it there, but we're learning something new. And for new audiences, which of course was one of our aims, they were making significant trips to come and visit these new exhibitions or events because of what that they'd seen about the programme, and that was all coming from this and stemming from these research partnerships, not only on property but academic partnerships as well. And finally, sorry, I'm conscious of the time, I'll go through this very, very quickly. It wasn't just about academic partnerships, it was about community and creative partnerships as well. The National Trust, as I've said, are a massive organisation. We know we have the clay, we don't always have the tools, but we, as a way of expanding our heritage and connecting to new audiences, creative partnerships were crucial. These happened at regional level and at national level as well, and we were able to work with some fantastic partners like Jarvis Cocker and Jeremy Deller. 53% of visitors will come into these installations intentionally, and that feels really important throughout the People's Landscapes programme and the Women in Power programme. We saw people wanting to respond to these stories and to the creative outputs and to the community outputs. We engaged 36,000 people through Women in Power, through community partnerships, which we hadn't been able to do before. And again, this was sort of surfaced to a national scale. This wasn't just happening at one property and then it's happened and it's over. It was happening across the country. And I'm sorry, I know I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop now. Creative partnerships allowed us to sort of, all those people kind of grumbling and questioning whether the National Trust should be talking about things like protest and activism and women's rights. These are all things we were already talking about. If you look at why the National Trust was formed, and if you look at the National Trust Manifesto today, it's about forever for everyone. It's about green space for all. These words that you see on the screen are from Jarvis Cocker, and I think people preferred to hear them from Jarvis Cocker than they did someone from the National Trust. And that was the benefit of forming these partnerships, that by saying it through a different voice and by connecting to communities and other people, the message became a lot kinder and a lot easier to hear than just kind of on a piece of interpretation in one of our properties. And yeah, just to go back to the aims, I think sort of these partnerships have helped us to do all of these things. They were able to position us as a national voice, they were able to help us work out what we wanted to say, and they were able to introduce us to new audiences and deepen connections to existing audiences. And I now, in sort of new time of the National Trust and what we're working on at the moment and the commitment to looking at global histories, I'm hoping we'll see these kinds of aims taken forward and put not just in one programme, across the whole organisation. So I'll stop now because I've gone over. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Helen. Now I'm going to pass over to Laurie again for the last Q&A of the day.
Okay, that was some really interesting talks. Thank you, everyone. I think we'll start with one for Helen. You kind of touched on this quite a lot towards the end, but I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the public response and kind of how maybe you dealt with that personally, sort of particularly negative side of things. If something that sounds like you've been quite involved with, how was that? How was that dealt with sort of organisationally, but also on a smaller scale?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest sort of public outcry came from Prejudice and Pride. I wasn't at the organisation then, but I mean, I could say my colleagues dealt with it admirably. And I remember one of our directors just saying that it was a they had to do it. We had to carry on and do it because we'd committed to it. And actually, when the people who shout the loudest aren't always the ones who are right. And I think that's personally what I always take forward when sharing or getting challenged about sharing marginalised histories. And when we looked at the evaluation afterwards, I think that for women in power, the response was something like 80% positive. And I think that's what I always kind of take forward, that at the time it feels like the sort of loud voices are the ones that, oh, everyone must be thinking this, everyone must be questioning it. But then, I mean, it's why I sort of said that research is so important, because I can show why we're doing it. It's like, this is relevant to us. Of course we should be the people talking about this. And actually 80% of visitors agree that we should be talking about this. So I think it's always, personally, I always say, just wait until the evaluation comes out and then we'll see how many people actually disliked it. But I think as an organisation, as an organisation, I think we were like, yeah, we're going to do this. There was a lot of support for it, and the properties were supportive of it, and central teams are really supportive of it. So yeah, I think it's a bit of a rambling answer, but I think we didn't even think that we would change how we were going to approach it, I think.
Thank you. I love that what you just said about people who shout the loudest are always the ones who are right. I wrote that down. I think that's important to remember. Okay, one for Pierrette now, which I think has already been discussed in the chat, but I think we'll go over it quickly just in case people prefer to listen to it. And it's a sort of, I'm going to combine one from Pernille and one from Melissa about the flagging on the database that you mentioned, which is asking, so this was about flagging kind of sensitive language or potentially topics about protected characteristics. Is how does the flagging work, and how did you decide on terminology for that kind of database work?
So how the flagging works is we use the museum system database, and you can make status flags for anything. So we make them for things like requires conservation, stuff like that. And because we had found it hard when people had asked us, how many objects do you have that might fit into Black History Month, or how many LGBTQ objects do you have? Previous to the exhibition, we'd already started to create these status flags and just said to the curatorial and documentation teams, if you see something, flag it, and then for future it means that we can find it. So we'd started that work. How we decided terminology was quite difficult to start with. It was just what sort of made sense to the person creating the status flags. And then as terminology has changed, we've tweaked things. So I think initially the LGBTQ plus one, I think, said LGBT. And so, we've just tweaked things a little bit as language moves on. I think we've also changed the one for Black history to being very broad, but I can't remember exactly what the title of it is. I haven't got it in front of me to look up how they've changed. So yeah, we kind of tweak things depending on research and sort of current sort of accepted terms. So yeah, and it's easy for us to edit that within the database.
Great, thank you. And another sort of similarly kind of more practical question is, Melissa wanted to know more about the chill out space for Pride and kind of what that was and how it works, and I guess what you put in place for that.
Yeah, basically we've just created a lounge in one of our meeting rooms. It's been in a different meeting room a couple of times, so we're a shared service with the library and the museum above, and it's one of the meeting rooms off the library. And what that means is that people who either don't want to be involved in the very loud, noisy environment of Pride, or perhaps don't want to identify themselves and out themselves in the town centre of Bolton and just want to be involved somehow in Pride, they can come into the library. At the back of the library, there's a space they can go to, and all of our sort of LGBTQ book stock, our LGBT trails for the museum, things like that are out, bits of information from local support charities. And then we also put out board games and stuff and just invite people to come and hang out in the space. And we found that particularly a large group of not large, but a particular group of neurodiverse teenagers has used the space quite a lot because it's quiet and it's not full of alcohol and loud noise. So that's been really nice.
Great, thanks for that. A question for Stuart now. So obviously the British Museum is a massive organisation. You mentioned that as part of the exhibition kind of development, you did a call out for involvement from all staff. And I just wondered, did you have any response from anyone who wasn't a curatorial member of staff?
Yes, we did, yeah. So there are people from visitor services, for example, who were really helpful throughout with things like the trail, like the logistics of highlighting things in the galleries. There are people from the imaging department, I think, you know, who looks after, sorry, my mind's gone, but the photo library people, someone from the photo library. Yeah, so we definitely got a cross section of people from different departments, which was really, really helpful. Not everyone could always make every meeting, so the composition of the group changed slightly depending on who was around when we had dates fixed. But there were a lot of curators involved in it as well. So because it was, you know, drawing on objects from every curatorial department, in terms of getting sign off for the label text and so on, it was like quite complicated. So as a project, it did involve an enormous number of people, and I'm really grateful to every single person who helped and contributed.
Great, thank you. We haven't, I think that is all of the questions we've had in. So unless anyone wants to quickly jump in, then I will pass over to Victoria to round up. But thank you, everyone. That was all really interesting.
Thanks very much, Laurie. Thank you for doing all of the Q&As today. There's quite a few to get through, I think, with all the speakers. So yeah, that brings us to the end of day one today of the conference. I'd like to thank all of the speakers today. I'm sure you'll agree that we've had a lot of interesting papers that have given us a lot to think about and reflect on. I'd also like to thank the SHCG committee, many of whom are working hard behind the scenes with various things today. So thank you for their support. I'd also like to shamelessly plug the SHCG quiz that Emma and I will be hosting this evening at 7:30. We've come up with all the rounds ourselves, so if you're able to join us at 7:30, we'd be delighted. We'd hope to finish the quiz around 9 or 9:30, so we'll hopefully not keep everyone too long at that, but do feel free to dip in and out of it if you don't want to spend the whole time with us. Also a reminder that day 2 of the conference will be starting at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. You should have already received the Zoom link for it, but another reminder is scheduled to go out tomorrow morning. So if you're able to catch that link, and potentially we can put it in the chat as well here. Just a note to say it will be a different Zoom link to today's link, and the same applies to the quiz. So there's sort of 3 Zoom links to connect to all 3 activities. For anyone who isn't a member of SHCG and would like to know more about the benefits of membership and what it entails, please do visit our website. There's a section called Join SHCG. Again, we'll hopefully put that in the chat now if you want to explore that in your own time. And we'll also be sending out a feedback survey after the conference. So please do keep an eye out for it and complete it for us if you can, to give us your feedback on what you thought of the conference, with it being our first conference online. So thank you very much for everyone for attending today. We hope to see you this evening, and if not, then tomorrow. So thank you very much.